Welcome to a simple example of using WPF C# and CRUD. I'm using the Visual Studio 2012 environment, so your environment might look just a little bit different. The first thing I want to do is create a brand new WPF project. Now you can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call my project Sample Database. Make sure you've selected WPF application. Click OK, and I'm also developing on the 4.5 framework. Now it's loading up my application. What I'm going to do is I have emailed everybody a file that has sample code in it, and I'm just going to have you paste that sample code into this project, and I'm going to explain what that code means. The first thing we need to do, though, before we start working with the XAML and the code behind, is to create a database. What I'm going to do is just right click on my project and choose Add New Item. Now some of you were having problems with this before, so hopefully you remember in class how you did yours. You could either choose the ADO.NET entity data model, or some of you were choosing the server-based database. Whichever worked for you, let's go ahead and just go with that for now. I'm going to go ahead and choose the ADO.NET entity data model, and I'm going to change the name. We're going to go ahead and keep using our Jefferson data model, and I'll just call mine Jefferson and click Add. And then it brings up our wizard. We're going to create from a database, so I'll click Next. I'll create a new connection, and it will be cactus.rvixi.com. Select the Use SQL Server Authentication, and I'm going to go ahead and use my credentials, which I already told you what they were in class, so it's not a big deal. I'm going to save the password, click on my drop-down list for my database name, and hopefully you will see databases showing up. One of the problems we had in class, some were having problems because they were using the guest network, others because they had a firewall blocking, so hopefully you were able to work through those samples. If you still have problems, please contact me so we can figure that out. I'm going to choose the Jefferson database, and then an important thing to do is always test the connection to make sure it's still working. Thank goodness everything works, so I'm going to go ahead and click on the OK button and continue on generating my code. Next thing I'm going to do is I'll click Yes. I'm going to go ahead and include the sensitive data, which will show password type stuff. And then this is important. Make sure you have selected or entered in a proper name for your entity. This will be your database context, and this will also create your connection string in the app.config. So that needs to be checked if you want to create that connection string. Otherwise you'll have to go do it manually. So I'm going to leave Jefferson entities and then leave that checked, and then choose Yes, and then click Next. It's then the system's going to extract the different tables and views. Lego was huge, so I'm only going to bring in the Prof. Ganderson. You'll bring in yours also, but this is the one that has the agent, the legal entity, the person, the phone, things like that. I'm not going to worry about any of the views, and I'm going to go ahead and leave the pluralize and singularize checked, even though that drove us crazy, and also include the foreign keys in the model. Here's another mistake students were making. They were forgetting to change their model namespace. Make sure that has some model name that you'll remember. I'm going to go ahead and leave mine as Jefferson Model and click Finish. The system will then go and generate the model associated with that database that I'm bringing in. Once the system comes back, you'll see your model diagram. And as we showed you in class, you'll be able to click on these different attributes and properties and even associations, and then see information about those associations, such as the multiplicity and referential constraints, things like that. I'm going to go ahead and close that model because I don't need it open, and I'll save all my changes to it. And from there, we're going to go ahead and start attaching code to our application. Now go out to the email that I sent you, and I want you to copy the XAML code, but I want you to copy it from the window loaded attached to the loaded property down to the end, and then paste that into your XAML source code. So it should look something like this. If you take a look up here, You'll see we have the window loaded. Make sure that you get rid of that closing tag, so window loaded is actually part of that. The other thing you might need to do is resize the actual form to make it look a little bit better. So go ahead and do that and save it, and let's see where we go from there. Let's take a look at the code that we've just brought in. Some of this we've already gone over in class, where we've spoken about the loaded method, which is called when the window is actually loaded up into memory. We're saying we want to call a method called window_loaded, which we will see in just a little bit. We then create a grid on our window, and we change the margin of it, and then we add 2 rows to that grid specifying their heights. The other thing you can do is actually change the border for each of those rows. And so we said turn the first row background to Alice blue and the second row background to light steel blue. Notice that the first row is 0, the second row is 1. Then we added a data grid to row 1, which is your second row, called it DG phones. And this is an interesting property to take a look at. Can user add rows? False. That means the user cannot edit the grid. They can only see the data and not change it. This is important to do sometimes because we want the user to go through our controls to work with the data, not just function on the grid, because we lose more control over that grid. So sometimes it's best just to turn off the editing on the grid. We also said just make it read-only. So the can user add rows equal false. That's also because we don't want to see that extra row show up on the grid, which is often used for adding new rows, similar to what you used to see in Access database. Then we added some buttons, one for the first, previous, next, last, another button for close, a label for the phone ID, a text box for the phone ID, label for the phone number, label for the text of the phone number, 2 more buttons for add, delete. These other controls actually are for this part of your form right here. Now I could have made that a lot nicer and prettier, but I just didn't worry about it for this sample. Of course, I'm going to want you to make it look nicer. So what's going to happen is when you run this program, by the time we're done, we want to show all the data in the grid, and then use this button to go to the first record, this button to go to previous records, this button to go to the next record, this button to go to the last record. In this text box, as they type in letters, we will dynamically search through the grid looking for that row. We'll have to do that through the text change event handler. The exit button will close the form. We'll use this button, this text and this text to actually gather data, and when they click on the add, we will execute a SQL insert, and then on this one we'll use this text box to have them type in a phone number. When they click on the delete button, we will execute another query to delete a record based upon whatever they've typed in here. Let's go take a look at the source code we now want to paste in. I'm first going to go ahead and save that project, and then I'll click on my window.cs file, and then let's paste in the source code from the sample that I emailed out. Once you paste it in, make sure that everything matches, that your namespace sample database matches your namespace that you created. That's critical to make sure those names match. Then save your project and click on build the sample database. Hopefully everything looks good. We can close that output window so we can look at all of our code. And let's take a look at what's going on. The first thing I want you to realize is that we created a variable called dbContext of type Jefferson Entities. Jefferson Entities is actually a database context variable. This is what gives you access to the database. And we made that right after our class, and so that will be public throughout our whole class. The next thing we did is we added some click events. This first click event just says this.close. That's attached to the close button's click event. The next event that was written was for the window loaded. That's attached through the window. If you look back over on the XAML file, that's attached on your window object in your XAML file right there. If you scroll down to find the button close, here's the button close, and if we scroll over you'll see that there's probably a click event for that pointing to that button close click event, which was the this.close statement. In the Windows loaded event we said the following. We created a variable called phone of type var, meaning it can be anything really, we don't really know the answer yet. And then what we did is we said the database context variable, which is our Jefferson entities, dot phones. Phones is a table associated with the database context, and it has a method called SQL query. It allows us to just type in a regular SQL statement, which we said get everything from the phone table and return it as a list. Then we take that variable, which is now a list of records from that table, and assign it to the item source for the data grid. And then we set the data grid index to be 0, which means go highlight the first record. If you don't do that, the selected index is a -1, meaning nothing is highlighted. So this is a way you can actually highlight your first record in your grid. We wrote an event handler for the first button, which says go set the select index to 0, so it will highlight the first row. Let's scroll down and take a look at some of these other methods that are already written for you. The next method, the last click event, that's for the last button. We said let's go to the count of the items in the grid and then subtract 1 from it, and that's because we're 0 base, so we have to bring it back 1 row. The previous button, we do the following. First of all, we said check the selected index and make sure that it's greater than 0. In other words, we still have room to move, and if we're not on the first record, then let's go ahead and decrement the selected index. If you don't do that, you can go out of bounds. You won't get an error, but nothing will be highlighted. The next button does just the opposite of it. It says, hey, let's go see what our current index is and make sure that it's less than our count. If it is, then we'll go ahead and add 1 to the selected index. Now we start having some fun with the add button, delete button, and the search button. And these are all attached to the XAML buttons in your other code. If you click on the add button, we do the following. We use our database context, which is the database object, and then we access the database itself through that DB context and a method called execute SQL command. That's the method we would use to actually perform things like inserts and deletes on a database. If we were just retrieving data back, we could just use the SQL query method associated with the table. We said for that DB context and the database, execute the following SQL command. Insert into the phone table a phone ID, a phone number, and a legal entity ID. We had to pass the legal entity ID also, since it's a foreign key and there's a rule in the database that says it cannot be null. We then said do the following. Pass values of phone ID, phone number, and legal entity ID. The @ sign says we're using parameters. If we had hard-coded the actual text box values there, that would allow somebody to do SQL injection. Whenever you work with SQL statements, you want to use a parameterized query for actual things like where clauses and values that you're passing to the query. So we said we're going to use these 3 parameters as values, and then if you notice, as part of that execute command, there's a multiple entries you can have as parameters. It's unlimited, and so we said another parameter we're going to pass is a new object of type SQL parameter. It's going to be the phone ID parameter, which, if you noticed right here, is your first parameter, and we're going to pass it the text phone ID dot text value. Then we do the same thing and create another object for the SQL parameter of phone number, passing it the text phone number, and another one for the legal entity ID. This time we just hard-coded the number 1000. We could have had a drop-down list with all the available legal entity IDs, done a SQL statement, and then loaded up the item source for that drop-down list. In this case, I just hard-coded a value. Those parameters are now assigned to the values, and it executes this command and inserts a brand new record into phone using the 2 text boxes and the legal entity ID of 1000. Then we recreate the var variable phone and do a SQL query select asterisk from phone as a collection and assign that collection to the item source for the data grid, and then once again highlight the first row of the grid. The next method we wrote was the event handler for the delete button. If they ever clicked on the delete button, we did the following. Once again, since we're going to actually execute a SQL statement that's not just returning data back but actually modifying the data, we have to use the execute SQL command on the database property for the DB context object. Now we could have done link for a lot of this work, but we've already seen that in class once, and I thought this might be fun to show you another way to work with the data. The other thing you need to understand and realize is that we are not doing data binding at all in this source code. Now if I had done data binding, a lot of the updates would have been easier to do. However, a lot of times in industry, some people do data binding, others don't. I need you to see both ways to execute this. On the delete click event, we did the following: database contact, database execute command, and then we said delete from phone where the phone number equals some parameter. That parameter, the phone num, is a new SQL parameter object, and we go and retrieve the text delete phone num text box text. So whatever they type in there as a phone number, we'll insert that into this SQL statement and delete all the records that have those phone numbers. Once again, we have to refresh the data associated with the data grid. So we create the variable phone, do our SQL query where we get all the records from the phone table as a collection, and assign that to the item source, highlight the first row. You're seeing that there's a pattern that's starting to happen. The last event handler we write is for the searching of the data. We write a text changed event handler. This is called every time you press a key inside of that text search text box. For every key press, it will call this event handler. And so what we do is we have a for loop that says let's search through all the items in the data grid, creating a data grid row based upon whatever row we're looking at in the data grid, and then we go grab the contents of the data grid and we grab the first column, which is the phone ID. Now if we wanted to work with phone number, that column would have been column 1. Then we check to see if it's not null and if it's equal to what we're searching for. If it does, then we go ahead and position our cursor on that newly selected row and move focus to that row. This process will continue until it finds data within that grid. In fact, we'll run this and actually see what happens. That's all the data that's associated with this. It's close to being a full CRUD for this form, and I want you to be able to go through and make sure you understand what you're typing in. I also thought it'd be a great way to get you started and provide some samples for you to go modify your other screens. Let's run this and just see how it works. So here's my screen. If you notice, I also added tooltips to each of the buttons: previous record, next record, last record. You can't see very well. I could change the colors if I wanted to, but currently this row is highlighted. If I click last, the last row is highlighted. Previous, 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 previous. Notice it does not go out of bounds, and that's because we have the source code saying don't go past the first record. Next, 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 same thing. We have a checker in there to make sure we don't go past. Let's add a brand new record. We'll give it a phone ID of 1000 and a phone number of 888-555-1212. We'll click the add button. We add it, we refresh the SQL, which refreshes the data showing up here. If we want to delete that number, we simply come down to phone number to delete, type it in, 888-555-1212, click on the delete button. It wipes that record out and redisplays it. One thing you might want to do, this is simple, is after you click the add button, reset these values. In fact, you could reset the values by saying txt_phoneid.text equals ... and then actually reposition your cursor, set focus to this control. Let's try to do a search. I'll type in 1009 and notice it drops down. Actually, what's happening is since there's a 100, it stays on the 1007. if I had another number in there, it would actually start to process through as I type the number. Once again, you might want to clear this out as you search. As you backspace, you could even make it do other things. Let's add another record, and let's do a 1017 and add that phone number back. Now let's come to the search and type in 1017 and it drops down. That's all there is to it. It could be made a lot better, but I hope this is good for you to at least get you started. And two more things that are really important. First of all, you need to make sure that in your app config, if you're having problems, that you have a connection string for the Jefferson entities. Remember also that if you do more than one database and you make a mistake, you delete it and you try to do it again, this file is not being updated, so you could have multiple connection strings added there. So make sure that looks proper when you're working. The other thing, if you notice, I didn't really put any comments in this code. Please check Learning Suite for an assignment that I want you to do to help you understand this code better. We'll see you back in class.